If a man gets murdered in the woods and his perpetrator happens to be female, does that make him any less dead? Seems an absurd question, but maybe less so if you understand the accountability gap and its impact on female violence. For anyone who hasn't heard me explain it before, this gap is not a single measured number like the mythical wage gap. It's more of a social attitude like gynocentrism, a dominant or exclusive focus on women in theory or practice, leading to prioritization of female interests, or a phenomenon like male disposability, the sidelining of men's welfare when it comes into contact with women's interests. The accountability gap is a gender disparity in societal expectations for personal accountability for the consequences of one's own choices, or, in other words, the exercise of one's own individual power. Men are always at least socially, if not legally, accountable for the exercise of their own individual power. In various ways, on both a social and legal level, men are both individually and collectively held accountable for the exercise of power by male populations, even those that are not local to them. Women are not always accountable for the exercise of their own individual power, and are often even able to transfer to men around them the responsibility for any consequences they cause. On a social and legal level, individual women are never held accountable for the exercise of power by any female population. Meanwhile, there's a power level one can exercise, mostly exempt from accountability, by claiming to be acting on women's behalf. So, what does this look like in real life? Let's consider individual power and choice. Public compassion for people disadvantaged by their own choices can differ widely depending on the person's sex. As a result, community resources offered to mitigate those consequences might be more reserved for women, or even denied to men altogether. A woman can make a long chain of ill-advised reproductive choices over which her individual power is absolute. From hello to I'm going to parent without you. Yet, her child's father is the one who will be called a deadbeat, denied custody, and then accused of abandoning his family, and obligated to pay support to the mother should her choices create a single-parent family unit. As the custodial parent, she will be eligible for public assistance, offered help by friends and family, and held up as a hero for weathering the hardship she has inflicted on herself and her children, as well as their father, whose hardship will go largely unnoticed. When you compare women's available choices to men's imposed obligations and the related social attitudes, the gap becomes readily apparent. Women have rights. Men have obligations. So, where does this come in on the topic of violence? First, let's establish one thing. By violence, I mean the dictionary standard. The use of physical force so as to injure, abuse, damage, or destroy. None of this, silence is violence, or your words are violence, namby-pamby feminist nonsense. When was the last time a mugger stole your wallet by threatening to ask you if your legs go all the way up, or if you had some fries to go with that shake? Not violence. Violence is experienced by its target as real, physical, present, dangerous, and willful, and it is used to directly do physical harm or cause physical damage. Words that are upsetting or even provocative aren't themselves acts of violence. One aspect of the gender gap in accountability regarding this subject is that most men do not even have to be told that, while many women would argue with you if you said that to them, maintaining that women have a right to consider some forms of rudeness to be violent and respond to them with violence, and men are obligated to show women a certain level of respect. The difference in recognizing what is or is not violence and when it is necessary versus inappropriate begins in childhood. Boys learn through fighting and play that using violence to get what they want from other people comes with a spectrum of potential consequences that make diplomatic behavior toward each other a more attractive or at least less painful way to success. They learn to exercise caution with provocative language and how they respond to it, as violence is an escalation that can't easily be stopped, much less reversed. Through this socialization, via testing each other and adjustment of their own behavior, groups of boys naturally arrange themselves into a loose hierarchy resembling a team, even if an adult doesn't organize their activities. Girls' natural tendency toward relational rather than physical aggression teaches them a different set of lessons that doesn't necessarily include the ability to anticipate and recognize all of the potential consequences of engaging in physical violence. What boys establish through physical fighting and play, girls establish through a system of social acceptance or exclusion. These experiences predispose girls to respond to insults and other forms of rudeness or provocative speech directed at them as if they have been targeted with violence. This is not to say that girls cannot be prone to engaging in it and cannot learn its consequences. They are simply less likely to take the risk of direct physical confrontation when they are able to use social manipulation, and more likely to blur the lines between the two when confronted with either one. In addition to gender differences in the establishment of social boundaries and hierarchies, there are gender differences in expectations for individual behavior, and in the treatment of the individual as an acceptable target for violence. Social attitudes among parents and mentors regarding how girls should behave and what they should experience can further shield them from both experiencing and participating in violence, while boys are more likely to be permitted opportunities to learn to navigate it, but less likely to be protected from it when it crosses the line between a normal childhood learning experience and damaging abuse. When allowed to mentor their sons, fathers help them develop diplomacy and the ability to defend against violence by modeling and verbally emphasizing lessons involved, as well as teaching them how to assess when to call an authority. Women have an unfortunate tendency to disrupt boys' development in this area by responding to it from the feminine, non-physical confrontation standpoint. When fathers are allowed to mentor their daughters, they teach them similar lessons about diplomacy and personal defense in regard to violence, but it's mothers who are more often able to equip their daughters to handle other girls' relational aggression, including how to fight back. That behavior often blindsides men and boys, and oddly, many women are blind to how their sons may be targeted with it until they are hurt by it. Meanwhile, the one-way taboo males face against engaging in violence towards females is taught to children of both sexes. Boys learn that under no circumstances is it acceptable for them to engage in violence against girls, but they are instead obligated to protect them against violence. Not only do girls not get an equivalent lesson about any kind of aggression toward boys, they grow up surrounded by media and other social messages indicating that they're entitled to use violent defense against a man or boy if they think he has been rude to them. They learn to expect a right to immunity from violent or aggressive conflict when they provoke one, with the expectation that boys and men will act on an obligation to protect them. By the time they are adults, most men avoid unprovoked aggressive violence as useless and distasteful at best, seeming to view it as immature or shameful, except when faced with a need for the protection of those around them from others' violence. This is expected of the average man, especially if women are targeted. Women are fortunate to be largely exempt, not held to any expectation that they should be prepared to engage in violence, and especially not against each other. They're not expected to be prepared to defend themselves, much less the men in their lives. Women who are prepared to protect their children against violent threats are seen as especially tough and strong, going above and beyond. Mama bears. Boys learn that their interest in avoiding becoming targets for violence comes with an obligation to refrain from provoking others to violence. Girls learn that theirs is a right. Why, then, would girls learn equal control over their aggressive impulses? Women's personal violence is not even recognized as equally threatening or abusive, and may even be treated as justified or comical. For example, picture the following. You are watching two people at a bus stop, Person A and Person B, who are complete strangers to each other. Person A says something rude and sexually suggestive to Person B. Person B, shocked, offended, outraged, hauls off and smacks Person A. When I present this scenario to people, women will often respond that A, obviously a man, engaged in street harassment, and B, obviously a woman or girl, had a right to hit him. That changes when I ask them to imagine the sexes are reversed. What if person A, the rude, crude sex pest, is female, and person B, who threw hands in response to rude words, is male? Suddenly, A's rudeness is recognizable as just words, and that's no excuse for B to hit a woman. Depending on their own beliefs, some will even accuse B of slut-shaming A. People rarely arrive at the truth that yes, regardless of gender, A was behaving rudely and inappropriately, but B's reaction was a disproportionate and unnecessary escalation. In responding to both sides of the gender flip in this scenario, people tend to excuse or downplay the woman's behavior while condemning whichever side of the interaction is attributed to the man. Rowan and Martin's actual bus stop sketch with Artie Johnson as the masher and Ruth Buzzy as the old maid who hits him with her purse is not the only one that relies on female aggression as a form of physical comedy. How about the Castle Anthrax scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail with Michael Palin as Sir Galahad the Chaste, confronted by a flittering horde of sexually aggressive maidens? Imagine how quickly people would have stopped laughing if he had hit one of them to defend his personal boundaries. You can gender flip the sketch, but not the direction of the aggression. Women have a socially recognized, legally protected right to freedom from male aggression. Men have a socially and legally imposed obligation to exercise restraint in their defense against female aggression. Feminist advocates have used the gender gap to their advantage in agitating for gender discriminatory law and policy, and in doing so, they have increased it. They use it in their language, with most of their rhetoric phrased around concepts of male aggression and female victimhood. They use it in their arguments, which pit the idea of women's safety and welfare against men's civil rights. This formula has been very successful. There is a huge international legislative focus, specifically on the prevention of violence against women. Criminal law in general addresses violence against both sexes, but the only gender specificity in it is in regard to female victims, despite the fact that the majority of violent crime victims are men. If you ask why, feminists who lobby for anti-male discriminatory law will come out of the woodwork to tell you that most violent crime perpetrators are men. They argue that this indicates that violence is a male behavior for which men as a population are responsible, and of which women as a demographic are victims. They'll twist the statistics, ignoring categories of violence that mostly or even almost exclusively affect men, to focus on the tiny minority of categories through which they can dramatize female victimhood. For instance, most homicide victims are male, but feminist lobbyists don't want to talk about them. They like to break homicide down into categories and cherry-pick, claiming most female victims of homicide are killed by a domestic partner or family member. The truth is that while the phenomenon of fatal partner violence is terrible, this represents a tiny percentage of the population. A small percentage of homicides happens to both sexes and tells us nothing about men or women in general. Homicide is not an exclusively male behavior, nor are all male-perpetrated homicides free of female influence. It doesn't take much searching to find news stories about women who have murdered or attempted to murder their domestic partners for a variety of reasons, including those who kill for life insurance payouts, and women who have hired or tried to hire others to commit the murder for them. That doesn't stop feminists from using their partner homicide talking point to demonize men and to gender the discussion on violent crime in general and intimate partner and sexual violence specifically. In the United States, this translated into a years-long pressure campaign for gendered intimate partner and sexual violence law. During congressional subcommittee hearings in 1978, for instance, feminists submitted unsupported rhetoric from the writings of feminist authors who made extraordinary claims about a patriarchal society using violence to exercise power and control over women, as if they were quoting chapter and verse from some unquestioned religious text. This was the evidence they used against the need to exercise equal consideration for male victims, and hold female perpetrators equally accountable under the law. The initial result in the United States was the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act of 1984, which was gender-neutral and established funding for victim shelters as well as a 24-hour hotline and guidelines for law enforcement to prevent tolerance for criminal violence that happens between family members or within a domestic partnership. Unsatisfied, feminists continued agitating throughout the 80s, with publications like Ms. Magazine platforming deliberately biased and heavily flawed radical feminist work, which was then reported on by more mainstream news outlets and later used in congressional debate on new legislation. This was the culmination of a search, not for accuracy, but for higher statistics on the prevalence of male-perpetrated rape targeting female victims. This process was covered in a 1993 Toledo Blade series titled Rape, the Making of an Epidemic, in which it was pointed out that various feminist researchers were tailoring their work to achieve that goal. The winner, Kent State Gender Studies professor Mary P. Koss, designed a survey method with a goal of writing feminist dogma over her respondents' answers. To do this, she used questions with descriptions of actions and avoided direct language like "against your will" to avoid cluing respondents into the fact that the researcher was going to designate their yes answers as incidents of rape. In addition, she designed her definition of rape to exclude instances where the perpetrator was female and the victim was male. Her excuse for this was stated in her 1993 report, Detecting the Scope of Rape, a review of prevalence research method, where she wrote, "It is inappropriate to consider as a rape victim a man who engages in unwanted intercourse with a woman." That's it. There isn't some fancy doublespeak or buzzword-laden logic or reasoning behind the exclusion. She just didn't want to call the same behavior that is called rape when a male perpetrator does it to a female victim the same thing when the sexes were reversed. She didn't want to gather statistics on female perpetration of the same crime. Why? Because those statistics couldn't be used to influence governments to enact law and policy that presumed perpetrators to be male and victims female. Specifically, then-Senator Joe Biden used Mary P. Koss's biased rape prevalence research, which excluded male experiences from the category of rape, to advocate for the Violence Against Women Act, which updated FVPSA with new standards. What were they? The law contains sexist, female-centric language, funding for research deliberately biased to create the illusion of justification for gender-biased policies, and restrictions on criminal justice departmental funding designed to influence personnel at every level by incentivizing gendered policy on arrest, conviction, sentencing, and sentence enforcement. The law and its funded policy and programs use the gender-biased Duluth model of response to intimate partner and sexual violence. This model operates on feminist patriarchy theory and assumes these types of violence are a male behavior used to dominate and control women. Under Duluth standards, women not only have the right to protection and recourse against violence and to be presumed innocent when accused, but also to be presumed harmless and or blameless when undeniably guilty. Men are obligated to exercise restraint when engaging with women under every circumstance, and to take one for the team if they are accused, even when they are demonstrably innocent. Policy at government agencies is still influenced today by these standards and by Mary Koss's work. The Center for Disease Control uses CASA's definition of rape in their National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, used to gather statistics that inform the creation of law and other government agency policy in the United States. After they published their first survey reports from 2010 and 2012, I filed a Freedom of Information Act request for some of their raw data. They replied that I couldn't use their data unless I agreed to a conference call, after which they actually only gave me part of what I'd requested. During the call, I asked them point blank why they had excluded being forced to penetrate from their definition of rape, and their answer was quite revealing.
Regarding the male respondents reporting being forced to penetrate, well, it didn't really give a very clear reason why that was treated differently than when a female is forcibly penetrated. Do you have some explanation on that?
The first response.
Well, what it does is it just basically says that was excluded from the definition of rape. But what was the criteria for deciding that being made to penetrate wasn't rape, whereas being forcibly penetrated was?
Implying this gender gap in accountability for violence under written law, policy, and guidelines for every level of the criminal justice system has created an egregious level of discrimination. There's research that shows how this manifests. Jennifer Langen-Richenrolling and her group stated in their report on rates of bidirectional versus unidirectional intimate partner violence that from their sample, approximately 2/3 of intimate partner violence reported was bidirectional, meaning both partners engaged in violence. And of the reported violence that was unidirectional, approximately 2/3 was female perpetrated. In another report on differences in frequency of violence and reported injury between relationships with reciprocal and non-reciprocal intimate partner violence, Daniel J. Whitaker and his group found similar results. In non-reciprocally or unidirectionally violent relationships among young adults, women were the perpetrators in more than 70% of cases. Reciprocity, or bidirectional violence, was associated with more frequent violence among women, but not men, meaning overall women engaged in more violence, including times during mutually violent relationships where the woman is using violence and the man is not defending himself. In this study, women's greater perpetration was reported by both women and men, meaning this isn't just male allegations against women, but women admitting to the behavior. This report also referenced a meta-analysis which found that a woman's perpetration of violence was the strongest predictor of her being a victim of partner violence. then went on to point out research which indicated that the feminist preferred explanation of self-defense cannot fully explain the reciprocal violence phenomenon. The report also stated that men were less likely to hit back than women were when their partner initiated violence. The most reasonable conclusion one can draw from this is that women initiate violence more frequently in mutual violent relationships, as well as being the perpetrators in most one-way abuse. Why? Well, as I pointed out earlier, as children are growing up, boys learn that their interest in avoiding becoming targets for violence comes with an obligation to refrain from provoking others to violence. Girls learn that theirs is a right. Why then would girls learn equal control over their aggressive impulses? This brings up another question or two. How would a boy learn to report that he had been targeted for violence? Why would a man recognize his own right to report that his intimate partner had engaged in violence against him? Deborah Pawnee, in her study on male victims of coercive control, asked men about their experiences with threats of violence and violent assault. She found that 66% of her male survey respondents had been threatened with harm, and in 49% of cases they reported that their abusers had threatened to harm themselves. 54% had been assaulted by their abusive partners in front of their children. She reported that over 1 in 5 men in the sample had been forced to penetrate as a pattern of coercive control. Some of the men who participated in her survey discussed their experiences in audio interviews, which Deborah compiled into 2 10-minute videos on her YouTube channel. Among them were instances of extreme violence, including the victim being attacked with sharp or heavy objects, resulting in severe injuries that required medical treatment. Meanwhile, what happens when male victims of partner violence report their experiences to police, or seek assistance from domestic violence shelters? If boys learn to avoid provoking others to violence, and to not view girls as violent or see girls' violence as unprovoked, and girls learn an entitlement to respond violently to being insulted, what biases will make up the filter through which adult male and female police officers view male victims reporting female-perpetrated violence? How about caseworkers at partner violence victims services? In their report on the help-seeking experiences of men who sustain intimate partner violence, Emily M. Douglas and Denise A. Hines stated that men who sustained all types of intimate partner violence report that the hotline workers say they only help women, infer or explicitly state that the men must be the actual instigators of the violence, or ridicule them. Male help seekers also report that hotlines will sometimes refer them to batterers programs. Some reported that when they call police during an incident in which their female partners are violent, the police sometimes fail to respond. Other men reported being ridiculed by the police or being incorrectly arrested as the primary aggressor. Some reported being falsely accused by their abusive partners, and some reported losing custody of their children despite evidence of their partner's abuse and their own nonviolence. In the general court system, female perpetrators are not treated as harshly as male perpetrators. In separate studies, Sonia Starr, an assistant professor at the University of Michigan, and Jill K. Donner, a Bowling Green State University student doing research for her doctoral thesis, found that convicted men receive much longer sentences than women convicted of the same crimes with the same basic details. Starr found similar disparity at every step of the process, from police response, where women are less likely to be arrested, to time served, where women are more likely to see rehabilitative therapies substituted for incarceration, and if incarcerated, to serve less of their sentences already shorter than those imposed on men before being released. Knowing this, can we really use crime statistics as an accurate measure of the gender imbalance in criminal violence perpetration? The pattern of imbalance may be partly influenced by gynocentrism, and partly influenced by feminist activism. The National Organization for Women has actively promoted some of the myths surrounding gender disparity in sentencing, mixing description of real issues like prison rape with claims that women commit crimes only as accessories to male criminals, and using anecdotal description to suggest that female criminal behavior is the result of abuse by a man. Lobbying on behalf of female accusers also influenced the U.S. Federal Department of Education to mandate a kangaroo court system among universities, which led to a tidal wave of due process violations against mostly male students, resulting in hundreds of lawsuits. Male students don't even need to actually engage in sexual violence to face severe repercussions. They only have to be accused, and their universities will drag them through an invasive, often gaslighting process wherein they face trial and a form of conviction without any recognition of their right to confront or cross-examine their accuser, their right to submit exculpatory evidence, or even their right to the presumption of innocence. Female students, on the other hand, aren't facing the same issue. In 2015, Amherst College was sued by a male student who was expelled for rape after a female student who had performed oral sex on him while she knew he was blackout drunk and she was fully lucid, filed a complaint against him. The male student, referred to in the civil complaint as John Doe, did not even know the incident had occurred until the university complaint was filed. What the female student admitted to doing is something women's advocates would label rape, if a lucid male student did it to a blackout drunk female student. Yet the school found John Doe responsible for the incident. After the school handed down its verdict, Doe found text messages proving his accuser was actually the aggressor, knew he was blacked out, and admitted she was the one in control the whole time. In a real trial, withholding this information would have been a crime, but the female accuser faced no repercussions for doing so. Further, though these facts should have been interpreted under the school's policy to make her a perpetrator and him a victim of rape, the university did not change its finding. Apparently, even when blackout drunk and unable to appraise his actions, a man is obligated to ask a woman's consent before she rapes him. Women have rights. Men have obligations. The consequences to men when rights protections and personal accountability for violent behavior are handled unequally under law and policy are less recourse and fewer resources for recovery victims, and fewer or less harsh repercussions, if any, when their perpetrators are female. While women's consequences are less injurious and self-imposed, it's important to recognize that abusers make themselves unable to maintain the comfort of a loving, trusting, intimate partnership. But let's ask the question feminists like to ask in relation to this topic when it's male violence under discussion. What about the children? According to statistics from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, mothers are the perpetrators of the majority of child abuse committed by parents, including in approximately 2/3 of cases of fatal child maltreatment involving only one parent. These facts have been consistently shown in HHS statistics for more than the last 20 years, with small variation in how much of a majority mothers hold. While the National Organization for Women argues that fathers should not have custody rights on the claim that men are deadbeats and abusers, this information indicates that it is vital to the welfare of children that both parents are involved in their upbringing, even if separately, and that each is aware of the other parent's relationship with the child in order to protect the children against risk of abuse, and to protect each other in maintaining healthy parenting styles. Children raised in violent environments are also at risk of significant changes to their behavior and character, including becoming violent themselves. In the report for their meta-analysis on research into childhood exposure to violence and lifelong health, Terry E. Moffat and the Klaus Grau 2012 think tank highlighted multiple areas of biological impact that experiencing or even witnessing violence can have on a child, including telomere erosion. Telomeres are repetitive gene sequences that cap the ends of chromosomes and are involved in replicating human tissues, healing, aging, and mortality. Children who experienced 2 or more kinds of violence exposure showed significantly more telomere erosion between age 5 baseline and age 10 follow-up measurements. In layman's terms, this means that exposure to violence in childhood has been linked to biological changes which can accelerate the body's aging process and hinder its healing process. They also found that children who experience violence experience chronic inflammatory states, potentially leading to tissue damage and other chronic health conditions like diabetes and heart disease. This has been linked to risk for psychopathy. It's a known cause for depression and has been associated with several other psychiatric disorders. Associations exist between childhood victimization and adult mental disorders in relation to exposure to domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect, which the report linked to a variety of poor health outcomes. In fact, the group stated that it is difficult to identify a disorder to which childhood victimization is not linked. It is significantly associated with mood disorders, anxiety disorders, behavior disorders, and substance abuse disorders, and with an individual having more than one of these disorders simultaneously. This included disorders that make the sufferer more prone to responding to stressors in their own environment with violence, meaning if you grow up witnessing and/or experiencing violence in the home, you are at higher risk of becoming a perpetrator of violence in adulthood. This is not to say that the experience of violence in childhood excuses adult perpetration, but that to meet a goal of reducing adult perpetration, one must necessarily consider the impact of these childhood experiences and the therapies needed to help child victims of adult violence avoid that outcome. It also offers us another reason to recognize that female violence is not harmless. It's not even less harmful than male violence. It's just violence that happens to involve a female perpetrator. The failure to recognize and account for this in society has created a huge gender gap in compassion for victims and in personal accountability of perpetrators, both by social standards and under the law. It has far-reaching consequences, including increased patterns of intimate partner and sexual violence, as well as child abuse, due to gender differences in standards for moderation of one's own behavior. These patterns could contribute to overall patterns of adverse physical and mental health conditions, family conflict, and criminal violence in our culture. Not to the degree that addressing female violence could become a magic genie that solves all of society's problems, but such that it is demonstrably important enough to have significant impact on most of them. To put it another way, in regard to treating violent behavior as the social disease that some theorists consider it to be, one change could act as medicine that could put many of society's illnesses and wounds on a healing path. All we have to do is raise women's personal accountability to the same level as that of men, and society's compassion for men to the same level that women enjoy. Make law and policy genderless, and remove funding that encourages gender-based discrimination in systems that address violent perpetration or assist victims of violence. Women would have rights and obligations, and men would also have rights and obligations. Human rights advocates of all stripes should support that. After all, it's about equality. Isn't that what we all want?